So I've been playing a lot of Baldur's Gate 3 and D&D lately for, I don't know, the past many months. And I kind of like tier lists. I think they're fun. It's fun to rank different abilities and stuff in all sorts of video games. So I thought I'd be doing this for cantrips in Baldur's Gate, but most of these cantrips are also basically the same in D&D as well. Some of them have been changed a bit, so it might not correlate exactly, but yeah. So the first cantrip we have here is Acid Splash. Now, the special thing with Acid Splash is that I think it's the only cantrip in the game that deals splash damage or can hit multiple enemies in like a splash radius. Some of the other spells also have can target multiple enemies later on. Eldritch Blast, for example. I think Poison Spray as well, but it's like close range. This is like a ranged attack, like a tiny fireball, but it deals acid damage instead. So for that, it's actually a pretty good cantrip. The downside is that it's only 1d6 of damage, which is not a whole lot, but in some situations you might come up against a lot of like a very small health enemies. So the example that comes to mind for me is that one basement in Baldur's Gate with the hundreds, it feels like hundreds of different rats. They all have like 2 HP or something, like very low health opponents. But if you have these splash damage attacks, you can just take out like 6 of them in one hit or something. So for that, I would probably take it up in this a bit above average. Solely because it has, if it wasn't like an AoE attack, basically, it wouldn't be as high. It would probably be down here. But because it has that utility in that way, it's actually pretty good. So the next one we have is Blade Ward. So Blade Ward gives you resistance to, I think it's bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. So all the physical damage types where people hit you with weapons like bows or swords, which a lot of enemies do, both in D&D and Baldur's Gate 3. And it gives you this resistance for 2 turns. I believe it can only be used on yourself. I don't think you can cast this on other people. And it's kind of one of... It's pretty good in the sense that it gives you resistance to a damage type that is very common, and it might negate a lot of damage. But the thing with these types of spells is that you gotta think, is it worth spending your action not dealing damage that turn to negate damage for a little bit, or is it more valuable for you to just dish out damage on all of your turns or on that turn? But I can see some situations where it is useful, especially because it's 2 turns. So if you're possibly in a position where you're not taking a lot of damage right now, or maybe you don't have the movement to get up to an opponent, you can apply Blade Ward, and then for the next turn go in and hit all the enemies, and you will have resistance. So for that, once again, I would probably put it up here in this tier. Is it above? I don't know if it's above Acid Splash. We'll just put it here in the same tier for now, and maybe we'll move some of them around later on. So the next cantrip we have is Bone Chill. It's a necrotic damage type. I believe it's 1d8 of damage, so it's pretty good damage. And the unique thing with Bone Chill is that it prevents other enemies from healing, basically, or receiving any kind of healing. I wouldn't say it's super useful And another thing is also gives disadvantage on undead targets, I believe. Yeah, an undead target receives disadvantage on attack rolls. Now, I think that's like an okay effect, but the thing is that a lot of the undead targets, or at least some of the undead creatures, they typically have resistance to something like necrotic damage. So you're not gonna deal a whole lot of damage, and I don't think it's worth it dealing less damage to gives a target disadvantage always. But it's mainly the preventing healing aspect of this cantrip that's really, really good. At least average tier. Is it above average? I mean, sometimes you're up against an opponent which has some really annoying healing abilities, or they constantly get healed by others. If you're up against a creature of that type and it comes in really, really clutch. But it's also one of those, like, how many of those kind of battles are you really up against? So I think I would just put it in average tier right here. Because it's really, really good in some situations, but in most situations I would probably use some of the other cantrips over Bone Chill. So next cantrip is Dancing Lights. So basically what this cantrip does is it illuminates an area of about, I think it's like 30 feet or something, in like a circular shape. And if it's like a obscured area, it's now fully lit up. It's like, in terms of like combat, the only situation I can think of where this is like useful is if you're up against some kind of creatures that get stronger in darkness. So like the shadows in the Shadowlands, where they basically become invisible in the darkness, and just putting this somewhere in a dark spot can help you a little bit in that. But again, you're using your whole action on placing this thing, which I don't think that's enough benefit basically to make it worth using like 99% of the time. So for that, I would probably put this as the first one in the RP tier. This is not to say that it's not cool. It looks cool. It's a cool like effect. It's just not very useful in like combat or a whole lot of situations. So yeah, it probably belongs here. I would say it's not really defensible to put it any higher. So the next one we have is Eldritch Blast. So this cantrip is a bit special in the sense that it deals 1d10, which is really, really good for a cantrip of force damage. And force damage is arguably the best damage type in D&D and Baldur's Gate 3. You could argue something like Radiant is pretty good too, but I would even say force damage is better than Radiant, simply because there are very, very few opponents that have resistance to force damage. And the special thing is that the higher, once you get up in higher levels, where a lot of the cantrips get stronger at certain levels. So it's every 5 levels your cantrips get stronger, and Eldritch Blast just gets more bullets. So at level 5 it will have 2 Eldritch Blasts, so it's basically 2d10, but you can split the bullets on 2 different opponents, which might not sound really useful, but it's very, very powerful in for example, situations where you know there's an opponent that's really low on health and you just need to finish them off. You don't need to spend your whole blasting power on that opponent. You can just divide that on that opponent and then start dealing damage to a different one. So it's really, really, really strong. It's for sure an S tier, or like the highest tier of cantrips. It's the best damage dealing cantrip in the game. Next cantrip we have here is the Firebolt. So Firebolt is 1d10 of fire damage, and it's a ranged attack just like Eldritch Blast. It deals the same amount of damage as Eldritch Blast, but the reason it's a bit worse than Eldritch Blast is, number one, it's one single target, so even when you level it up, it just deals a 2d10 of fire damage, but it's still on that the same target, so you don't have the option to split the damage on multiple opponents. And the second weakness is the fact that it is fire damage, and fire damage is not bad per se, it's just one of the damage types that it's really, really common for enemies, and even tieflings have fire resistance. So in some cases it's not gonna be as useful if you're up against opponents that have resistance to fire damage. You're gonna have to opt for something else, which is why it's nice to have other options for damage dealing cantrips than just Firebolt. But other than that, it's actually a pretty good cantrip, because it's still like a d10 of damage. So for that I would probably do it, put it in this tier, I guess. I would say it's still higher than Acid Blast, just because it's useful in a lot of cases. Yeah. Anyways, the next cantrip we have here is Friends. So Friends gives you, it's one of the special cantrips that doesn't really do anything in combat. It's like a roleplay, or in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, it's a dialogue only cantrip. But it basically gives you advantage on, I think it's persuasion checks, which again you might think like, how good is that? But it's actually pretty useful, because there's a lot of situations, especially in Baldur's Gate 3, where you can completely avoid a combat scenario simply through persuading or deceiving your way through like a dialogue with an NPC or something, and you still get the same amount of XP for quote unquote avoiding a combat scenario as you do beating it or fighting that scenario. In that case, it's actually a pretty good one, a pretty good cantrip to have, especially if you don't have super high charisma on your character. Having advantage on your rolls can do quite a lot to help you. So for that, I would probably it would at least be in average tier, or I'm gonna put it in average for now. Maybe a little bit above average, just because it's pretty useful. All right. Next cantrip is Guidance. So Guidance is really powerful. So basically what Guidance does is it gives you or allows you to give another character an extra d4 on any skill check. Kind of similar to Friends in that sense that it's basically for the most part only useful outside of combat, but in those cases it comes in really clutch. So usually for most or all skill checks, you roll a d20 and then you add your ability modifier for whatever that roll is. If it's persuasion and you have like a +2 to persuasion, you add that +2 to whatever you rolled on the d20. And this one allows you to add an extra or roll an extra d4 and add that to the roll as well. D4 is the smallest dice, but in a lot of cases, just that extra little bit of modifier that gets added to the roll is enough for you to cross the threshold of succeeding the roll where you would have failed if you didn't have that guidance. And since it's like, even though it's like a cantrip you can only use on other people. D&D is like a team game, and even Baldur's Gate 3 you have your companions. Typically Shadowheart will be the one with guidance or somebody else. And they can just always, like every time there is a skill check, you use this guidance on that person. So it helps in basically all skill checks, makes them more likely to be successful. It's just really powerful. So for that, it's the second one we put up here in the highest tier. Really powerful. Most powerful cantrip outside of combat, I'd say. So the next cantrip we have is Light. So basically Light is kind of similar to Dancing Lights, except it infuses some kind of object and makes that object illuminate. So usually in Baldur's Gate this is the weapon that you wield. But again, it suffers from kind of the same thing as Dancing Lights in the sense that it's not really useful. It doesn't deal any like damage or anything like that. It's basically only useful if you're up against an enemy who benefits from some kind of darkness. It doesn't help. I don't even think it helps if you cast this light spell while being in like a darkness spell. Someone cast darkness on you. I don't think it removes any blindness or anything. So yeah, it's not really that great. I think the effect looks really cool. It's like you get like an enchanted weapon, like a Minecraft enchantment, which looks pretty cool. But that's why it's mostly in RP. It's like turning your weapon into a torch or something, which is okay, but I don't think it really should be any higher on the list. Next up, we have Mage Hand. So Mage Hand basically spawns in this little magical hand that you can move around, and it can interact with objects and throw some lightweight stuff around. And it's mostly like some extra utility. There's a few situations where it's useful to have something that can just be spawned in, perhaps at a place where you can't really reach that location very easily yourself. You can spawn in this Mage Hand, and maybe you can throw like an item back at your player, and you can use that for something, or interact with like a button or a lever or something. Those cases are useful. I even think once I used it to like throw a chest over that was in like a hard to reach location, and I could throw it with the Mage Hand and then unlock it with my characters. It's mainly like a bit of extra utility outside of combat, and there's not really too much use for it unless you want to throw some stuff in combat. But I don't know, it's not that great in that sense. For that, I would probably put it a little bit higher than the Dancing Light spells, but probably not too much higher than this tier, I feel. So a fun cantrip to have, but not crazy powerful. So the next cantrip we have is Minor Illusion. So Minor Illusion is also what I would call like a utility cantrip. It's one that works for the most part in like distracting some NPCs or enemies with this illusion that you place somewhere in a room, and maybe they will go investigate that, and then you can sneak past them. That's kind of the situations I imagine in my head where this is the most useful, both in Baldur's Gate 3 and also in D&D in general, which is pretty cool. I would say that's a lot more used than simply like a roleplay or looks cool. So for that, it would probably also go in the same tier as Mage Hand. Like, it has some uses where it's pretty impressive and pretty cool. It can help you out in some situations, but not like really much powerful or more powerful than that. So yeah, I'll probably put it in this a little bit below average, I would say. So the next cantrip we have is Poison Spray. So Poison Spray is basically 1d12, so it's the highest dice of poison damage, and it spreads out in like a small cone in front of you, which again is actually, it's pretty good in sort of the similar situations to Acid Splash that we put up here, in that it can hit multiple enemies. And the thing with this one is that it's only for the more close range, but it does have that more damage than Acid Splash does. So I would probably put it in the same tier for that, maybe a bit below, like here, something like that. Definitely slightly above average, because it can be quite useful in those situations where some smaller HP opponents, a lot of them swarm you, or some bats or something like that. You can use this to just poison a lot of them at once. So the next cantrip right here is Produce Flame. So basically this you create like a tiny little flame in your hand, which can light up, kind of similar to the light spell, except this one you can also throw and deal, I think it's 1d8 of fire damage. So for that, it's actually better than the light spell, I would say, because you can use it as like a mobile torch kind of thing. If you don't have any light source, you can produce this flame and have a little bit of light in that way. But it can also be used as like a mini attack. I think you could even, if you have this flame in your hand, and then combat starts while you have this, you can throw this, deal some damage, and then go back to your normal attacks. So it's probably a little bit below average, still, but yeah, it has some a little bit more use, because it can do a little bit more things than the light spell. So the next cantrip we have right here is Ray of Frost. Ray of Frost deals 1d8 of cold damage. So it's the only cantrip we have that deals cold damage. And then it's like a ranged attack, similar to the Firebolt, except this one also takes away, I think it's 3 meters or 10 feet of movement speed, or movement from your enemies. So you can slow them down a little bit, make it a bit harder for them to move around and switch positions, which can be useful in some cases. It's definitely not a bad cantrip, it's pretty good. I would probably put it around like same tier as Firebolt. You do have a little bit less damage when Firebolt is a D10, but cold damage, I think it's a bit better than fire, and it also has the slow feature. So for that, I would say it's about the same as Firebolt. So the next cantrip we have is called Resistance. It's sort of similar to Guidance. It's a concentration spell, and it gives that person an extra D4 to their saving throws, which means it does have some use cases inside of combat as well, but it's I wouldn't say it's super useful, mainly because you have a spell called Bless, which basically does the same thing. It gives a D4 to saving throws, but that one also gives an extra D4 to attack rolls, so it's like a better buff basically, and I wouldn't say it's really worth it to spend an action inside of combat to give an extra D4 to, and even a concentration you can only concentrate on one spell at a time, so spending that on protecting somebody else with only an extra d4 on saving throws, I wouldn't say it's that worth it. So for that, it's probably a bit below average. It's interesting how they're all the same color, all these ones, the worst ones. But anyways, yeah, I don't think it's super useful. So the next cantrip we have right here is Sacred Flame. So Sacred Flame is a ranged attack spell, and it deals 1d8 of radiant damage. Radiant damage I mentioned before when we talked about Eldritch Blast, that it's a really good damage type. Not many opponents have, or not many enemies or creatures have resistance to radiant damage. It's 1d8, and the unique thing about Sacred Flame is that it's not a spell attack roll, so you don't roll the d20 to attack opponents. Instead, it's a dexterity saving throw on the opponent. So the opponent has to make a saving throw to see if it hits or not. This, I would say, is a bit more useful in Baldur's Gate 3 than it is in D&D, because in Baldur's Gate 3, when you aim at a target with a spell, you get that little percentage marking that shows you how likely you are to hit the attack. How likely you are to land the attack. And sometimes on some opponents, their AC is actually better than their dexterity saving throws. So in some situations, you have a bit more likelihood to actually land an attack using Sacred Flame than you have if you were to use like Ray of Frost or a Firebolt. And that's the situations where I would say you would use Sacred Flame above something like Firebolt. And then also because it's the radiant damage. So some opponents have resistance to fire damage, and you used your Firebolt and you figured that out perhaps in D&D. And then you could switch over to using Sacred Flame. So in that case, I would say it's pretty good. Once again, it's 1d8. It's sort of in the similar situation to Ray of Frost, except this has the dexterity saving throw, and it's the radiant damage, which is almost as good as like force damage. Yeah. So the next cantrip we have is the Shillelagh. I can't pronounce the name of this spell. It's impossible to do it without sounding like you're way too many drinks in at the bar. Can I get a Shillelagh? How would you pronounce this? Shillelagh. Basically what the drunk spell does is it transforms your weapon into dealing 1d8 of bludgeoning damage plus your wisdom modifier. So it's mainly like, I believe it's only druids who get this cantrip, and that's also why it's mainly only useful for druids, because they are a wisdom based caster, so they use magic with their wisdom, and they typically don't always have super great melee weapons. So it's basically a way for you to use an action to transform your staff or something into something that's a little bit more stronger to hit people with your melee attacks. Oh, never mind, it's actually a bonus action. It's okay, an okay ability. I would personally prefer it more if it was an action and it lasted until like long rest, like a mage armor spell. But this one is only 10 turns, so you have to use it in combat. But since it's a bonus action, it's not really a big deal. You can just apply this in the beginning of combat, and you'll be fine. So I'd say it's a pretty average mainly because it's a bonus action. If it was an action, it would go probably a step down. But I would say it belongs here in the sort of average mid-tier, I guess. Yeah. So the next cantrip we have is Shocking Grasp. This is another cantrip that is purely melee range. So it's one you use in melee range, and it deals 1d8 of, I think it's lightning damage. I was about to say thunder damage, but it's lightning damage. Which lightning damage is a pretty decent damage type, I would say. There are even some opponents like constructs or like robotic opponents that are vulnerable to lightning damage, which makes this one pretty good in those situations. But the main big thing is that it's a cantrip that is useful in melee range, because the big weakness, I would say, for most spellcasters is that as soon as enemies get into melee range of you, all your ranged spell attacks, all your Eldritch Blast, your Firebolts, you name it, they all have disadvantage on the attack rolls, and now it's harder to hit opponents, and it's a bit annoying situation if you don't have any way to gain distance from them with a Misty Step or something. And that's where the Shocking Grasp is really nice to have. You have something that deals pretty good damage in close range. It's still a spell. It's usually a bit better of a choice than hitting them with your staff or whatever melee weapon you have. Except if you've used the Shillelagh. So for that, it's actually, I would say it's up here. I put a lot of cantrips in this tier actually. I think it belongs up here. It's 1d8, same as Sacred Flame, but it has the melee range capability. Oh, also another thing I forgot to mention about Shocking Grasp is that it also disables reactions on your opponents. So this is actually really useful, especially in the situation I just mentioned, where you're a spellcaster, an enemy comes in a close range. You can use Shocking Grasp, and if you land the hit, they lose their reaction. And what this means is that you can just walk away from that enemy without taking opportunity attacks. So you can do that without getting hit, because opportunity attacks are reactions, and you completely remove that. You can gain distance, you could even dash on the next turn or something. So yeah, it's a really good cantrip to have. Next up is Thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy is sort of similar to Friends in that it gives advantage on intimidation and performance checks. But yeah, it gives you advantage on those rolls, which can be pretty useful. I wouldn't say it's always as useful as Friends is, except if you're somebody who likes to intimidate a lot, or I don't know, you're like a bard who uses performance quite a lot. Then I guess it's fine. But I would say it's like average, but it's a bit below Friends, I would say, in most situations. The next cantrip we have is Thorn Whip. So this basically just pulls enemies closer to you. It's like 3 meters, which I think equals like 10 feet closer to you, which it's mainly like a druid. I don't know if rangers can get this as well, but I think it's mainly a druid cantrip, or from the druid spell list. I don't know what I don't think this is really that great, mainly because in most cases, if you are a spellcaster, unless you're something like a cleric and you have like spirit guardians on you that deals a lot of damage when people are close to you, you typically don't want people up in your face. You want to keep some distance. I can't really think of a situation where it's it's useful to use an action to pull someone closer to you, unless maybe if you use it on your allies and you can pull them away from something. I haven't really tried this cantrip out much, to be honest, so I don't really know if it's that useful. It doesn't sound super useful, but there might be some situations where it's pretty good, or it can do something, some pretty clutch things. So for that, I would probably put it in the same tier as these other ones. This is sort of the might be useful in or really good in some situations, but generally not too much. That's kind of what this tier has become. So the second last cantrip we have right here is True Strike. Now, True Strike is pretty infamous for being not a very great cantrip, and not very many people like it. Basically what it does is you apply this cantrip, use an action to apply it on some enemy creature, and then the next attack, I think it's only the next attack that's made against this creature is made with advantage. It's a concentration spell as well, so you can't just apply this one on multiple enemies. I don't know why you would do that anyways, but the main thing why this is not really worth it in like 99% of the time is that you're spending your action to apply this cantrip, where you could have just made an attack roll on that creature and then attacking it once again on your next turn, which basically is a bit better than getting advantage on one hit, because you have a chance to actually hit them 2 times. The only situation I can see, if you're like I don't know, some sort of a rogue perhaps, and like a high elf, where you've selected this as your cantrip, and you're not close enough to really deal any damage to an opponent, you can apply this on your current turn, and then the next turn you could go in and maybe get a sneak attack, because that requires you to have advantage on your opponent. But again, that's such a niche situation that yeah, I don't think it makes up for it to be anywhere close to the average tier. So for that, it's probably lowest right here in the bottom one. So the final cantrip we have is Vicious Mockery. This is a pretty fun cantrip. It basically allows you to mock a creature on range and deal 1d4 of psychic damage. It's not a whole lot, but it also gives that creature disadvantage on its attack rolls. Again, this is like it's a bard cantrip. Is like one of the main ways you deal a little bit of extra damage when you can't really cast any spells, or while you're doing some bardic inspiration or something. It deals a little bit extra damage. You can give your enemies disadvantage, which is a nice little side effect. I don't think it's more of a fun cantrip, especially in Baldur's Gate. You get a lot of fun lines your character makes when they use this cantrip. So for that, I think it's a bit below average. I think for the most part, I would much rather, if I have the option, I would much rather cast a Firebolt, or even like a Bone Chill, perhaps, or one of the other cantrips over Vicious Mockery. But again, it's a nice little extra thing you can do, and it's a ranged attack as well. So it's okay in that sense. All right, and that basically concludes the tier list. In my personal opinion, I don't think I would like to move anything around. I think this looks fine. And once again, it's not like I'm saying never pick any of these bottom cantrips or something like that. I sometimes like to choose cantrips based on like what kind of character you have. I have definitely picked Light or Dancing Lights or Mage Hand or something like that before. But in terms of like a value or like a strength kind of thing, would definitely recommend having at least like one of these damage dealing ones, and guidance if you have the ability to select that one. And let me know if you have any opinions on this, if you have your own tier list or something like that, your own comments. I would love to know about them. So drop them in the comments below. And with that said, have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye bye.